Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Pat Kennelly. I'm proud to serve as the director of the Marquette University Center for Peacemaking. The 2020 Peacemaker in Residence panel is unique this year because of its virtual format, and for the first time, we're highlighting not only a national leader, but also a local leader so that we get both that national and local context. I hope you'll enjoy this important, relevant, and needed discussion on Black women organizing for justice. This nation, the United States, is in the midst of a centuries-old and ongoing pandemic of systemic racism. At the Center for Peacemaking, we recognize the important historical and ongoing role Black women play in the movement for Black liberation. We're excited to have historian Dr. Nishani Frazier, Milwaukee advocate, activist Dynasty Ceasar, and author Vivian King with us tonight to discuss this topic. Tonight's webinar or panel is co-sponsored by CURTO, the Center for Urban Teaching, Outreach, and Research at Marquette University, and would not be possible without the generous donations and support of the many friends of the Center for Peacemaking. Thank you for making it possible. So let's get started. Our moderator tonight is Vivian King. I'm proud to count Vivian as a friend and a role model. Vivian has been active in using nonviolence to pursue change since she was in college and continues participating in peaceful protests to raise awareness and bring about liberation. She is a dynamic communications leader with an extensive career in broadcast journalism, public relations, and community relations. Vivian received her journalism degree from the University of Missouri-Columbia and spent more than 10 years and is a familiar face to many in Milwaukee from her time at WTMJ. She's also the author and founder of Vivian King Consulting, where she provides personalized consulting to individuals looking to find their voice through the media and connect with the community through workshops and forums. Before founding her business, Vivian served as the vice president for community relations at Aurora Healthcare, where she oversaw community sponsorships and caregiver engagement. More recently, her reflections and memoir after her stroke, When the World Suddenly Stopped, has been received with wide acclaim and is a finalist for the Author Elite Awards. If you've not gotten a copy, I highly recommend it. Vivian, we're so excited to have you, someone who has been so active in the community and is always looking to, help form the next generation of leaders. Thank you for being our moderator, and I'll pass it over to you.
Pat, thank you so much. You know, everybody at Marquette, I count you as friends. I count you definitely as a friend in our work with the Near West Side Partners, and it is always an honor to be a part of conversations at Marquette University. So I do want to let the audience know that this webinar is being live streamed on Facebook. It will also be recorded, and we will be having just a wonderful discussion today. I want to let you know what we're going to be doing. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Nishani Frazier. She'll give a presentation, followed up by Dynasty Ceasar with a presentation. And then after both of those, we'll have a panel discussion. Some of you sent us questions, so we will be reading those questions as well. However, if we have time, we want you to feel free to put questions in the chat because we may pull a question if we have time, of course, from the chat as well. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Dr. Nishani Frazier is the Associate Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Kansas. Prior to University of Kansas, she held positions as Associate Curator of African American History and Archives at Western Reserve Historical Society, Assistant to the Director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Archives at the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Change, and Personal Assistant to Dr. John Hope Franklin, before and during his tenure as chair of President Bill Clinton's Advisory Board on One America. Her research interests include 1960s freedom movements, oral history, food, one of my favorite things, digital humanities, and Black economic development. Nishani's recent book publication, Harambe City, The Congress of Racial Equality in Cleveland and the Rise of Black Power Populism, was released with an accompanying website also titled Harambe City. Dr. Frazier was formerly a fellow for Next System, examining the issue of gentrification's impact on the Black community. She now serves as the Director of Community Outreach for COVID Black, a task force and collective designed to combat health disparities within Black diasporic communities. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Dr. Frazier. We are looking so forward to learning from your expertise on the role of Black women in the 1960s freedom movements. Dr. Frazier.
My mother talks about the worst protest she ever participated in was in Chicago. This is after the violent attack against Dr. King. He's hit with a brick in Cicero.
And this is in 1966.
Yes, in 1966. And there's a heated debate about my mother talks about the worst protest she ever participated in was in Chicago. This is after the violent attack against Dr. King. He's hit with a brick in Cicero.
And this is in 1966.
Yes, in 1966. And there's a heated debate about whether he's going to go back. He doesn't. CORE insists on doing the second protest. And my mother said she was never so afraid as when she was in that protest in Chicago. And there was this white woman who was standing on the sidelines, and every time she could hawk, right, up spit. And I mean, like, it was one of those big old balls of spit, right? She's just, you know, getting it up in her mouth. She would spit on people. And so my mother is walking in this protest, and she's seeing this woman do this to as many people as possible from a distance. And she's on the outskirts, and my mother, there was a fear that she had being in that space. But when that woman started spitting, she said whatever sense of fear that she had just went away, and she had just decided she was going to lock eyes with that woman. And if she tried to spit at her, that was a day nonviolence was going to end for her. Because she was not she was not going to let her spit. And she would talk about how the woman would spit, and the spit would just roll down people's faces. My mother was like, I'm not having that. And my mother, I'm telling you, I thought it was so funny. She's like, I believe in nonviolence right up until you spit on me, and then that's when it's over. So she's walking past this woman, and there she is, she's getting ready to hawk another one. And she's looking at my mother like she's going to be the one. And my mother said she locked eyes with that woman, and she just gave her such a look. The woman swallowed all of that spit, just swallowed it all the way down.
I'm sorry. This is a funny story. Actually, this is part of an interview I did with a colleague of mine on teaching hard history. And that story for me, it sort of encapsulates some of the fluidity of nonviolence, right? So my mother was, I'm for nonviolence. Up until that woman decided she was going to spit on her, and then it just went all out the window. And I like to use that experience and then use it to juxtapose my father and his experience. My father's a Unitarian minister. He's part of the NAACP in Mississippi. And I actually was going through some old materials, and I found in an old box his essay on civil disobedience he wrote in 1965 on using nonviolence. It's amazing. I also found a first edition of Satyagraha, which we're actually going to talk about. It was compiled, the words and ideas of Satyagraha by Mahatma Gandhi is compiled after he is assassinated in 1948. But these two different ways, right, of seeing nonviolence is what we're going to be talking about today. So my mother's version, which is purely tactical, right? Because clearly she has a point and then nonviolence is over. And then my father, who's coming from a deep Christian tradition and a deep study of nonviolence as a spiritual force. And so we'll move now to the next slide. So part of the problem, of course, and the reason this conflict emerges has to do with the Black experience in the United States. It is heavily weighted by violence, whether it's in slavery or through segregation, with the issue of Black women being raped and lynching. And there is this moment in the 1930s, as early as the 1930s, where Black people are trying to think of ways to challenge segregation and at the same time deal with the nature of violence. And one of the persons who's deeply interested in this subject is a woman by the name of Sue Bailey Thurman. And Sue Bailey Thurman is not just any woman. She is a part of the National Council of Negro Women. She is an author. She's an essayist. She is a lecturer. She works for the YWCA and is in fact part of the Department for Interracial Interaction and Integration. She travels throughout Europe and establishes the YWCA World Federation. I mean, this is a powerful Black woman. She's married to Howard Thurman, very well-known Black theologian. And they go to visit, this appeared a number of Black people go to visit India to try to understand civil disobedience and nonviolence conceptually, but also as a religious ethos or a belief system, not religious, but a belief system. And it's in this moment that Sue Bailey talks to Gandhi, and she's a little bit skeptical about this nonviolence idea. And she says, how do you apply nonviolence where there are guns and lynching at the end of every trial, and there are no real trials anyway, and no courts to protect people? And Gandhi's response is, I must not wish ill, but neither must I cooperate with them. Refuse even to touch food that comes from them. And I refuse to cooperate even with my brother Negroes who tolerate the wrong, right? And so what Gandhi is doing is introducing all the strategies associated with nonviolence, and it's not just direct action protest. What's a key element here, and we'll talk about it later, is non-cooperation. Let's move to the next slide. But the reality is that for many people, this idea that Gandhi is offering is a little bit difficult for them. They can see it as a strategy for protest, but they cannot see it necessarily as something that they would spiritually follow. So what develops in the United States is this kind of two-pronged approach: those who philosophically approach nonviolence, and then those who tactically use it as a tactic to challenge segregation in the United States. The Congress of Racial Equality, an organization that emerges in 1942, is one of those groups who embraces the idea of nonviolent direct action as a tactic. And they pull from elements of both Gandhi and Sri Dharani. And I'll talk about Sri Dharani in a minute, to craft or construct the approach to nonviolence action in the United States. From the perspective of CORE, we have either a philosophical approach or a tactical approach. And what James Farmer, who is one of the co-founders and later national director of CORE, finds is that there are those who are means-oriented, that the means is really important. One cannot just obtain freedom without trying to change the heart of the oppressor. And then the ends oriented, those who are guided simply by the search and the end goal of freedom. that there's a tension between these two groups, and that Black people are more likely to be ends-oriented than follow the pacifist route of being means-oriented. It's research-informed, and this is really key. A lot of people look at the surface, and there are multiple dynamics associated with racism. Within CORE, there was a lot of detailed research. Now, what you'll find sometimes is that currently institutions have an inclination to use research as a kind of cover to avoid dealing with the issue of racism. That is not the point of research. Research is simply the tools and the information that you need to challenge and get at the powers at be in terms of who is responsible for this problem of segregation. Then CORE, and not everybody did this, and even CORE changed their strategy, moved from research to negotiation. You would try to engage in conversation to inform the person who's acting out segregation, hopefully with the idea that they would change their mind and do better. If they did not, you move from negotiation to non-cooperation and confrontational approaches to nonviolence. Now, this is not set in stone. All right. And part of it has to do with the two-pronged approach that nonviolence represents coming out of India and the freedom movement there. Next slide. There are two types of nonviolence. First, I'll talk about satyagraha. Satyagraha is soul force. This is a process. In fact, I will actually turn to Satyagraha, the book, and read a section out of it that I thought was particularly poignant. For the record, for the required course,
I see Dr. Frazier is a bit frozen, it seems. I hope that rectifies itself in a moment. As we are waiting for Dr. Frazier to come back in, I want to remind everyone that we are going to be taking some questions from the chat, even though I will have questions for the panel discussion. We are taking some questions in the chat. So please, as Dr. Frazier is talking, or as Dynasty Ceasar is talking, you know, sometimes a question comes up in your mind, and if you don't write it down right away, you may forget it or lose track of what you wanted to say. So if you put it in the chat, it'll be in front of us, and we'll be able to pull it up if we need that. Also, this is being recorded, and it is streaming live on Facebook. So if you have some friends who did not register but would like to follow us, then please point them to the Facebook Live. I'm sure you are like me in that the story of her mother in the beginning was quite hilarious. Can I see in the chat what people are thinking about that? Because her mom was a hoot. That's all I have to say about that. I can see why we talked yesterday, and she's torn between her mom's approach and her father's approach. So she has both of them in her. And I see that others are thinking that as well. One of our speakers says, yes, she is torn between those. Pat Canelli says, she humanized the way you never know how you'll respond. It shows nonviolence is accessible to everyone. It really is. And so that's, if we haven't learned anything yet, I think we've learned that. So keep them coming, everybody. Keep them coming. Sheena Carey says, I love the fact that she had a point that could not be crossed. Absolutely. Too often oppressed are told how they should respond to oppression. Plus we only have two cheeks. Exactly. And it's interesting because usually the people telling the oppressed how to respond are not oppressed. So how would they know? That's a very interesting question, and usually comes from somebody who has no idea or hasn't been in in that situation before. I am hearing that Dr. Frazier is about to jump back on, so she is coming soon, and we'll keep it coming. I think Sheena says, bottom line, it still comes down to control, really like self-control. You have to control yourself and really think, how should I respond? Because the response is really the thing that either is going to move something forward in a positive way, or allow it to deteriorate into something that none of us wants. Pat has typed in the chat, she showed that what is distilled through experience? Nonviolence. Sorry, Pat. Thank you. She showed that nonviolence is distilled through experience. It is meant for the public square, not theoretical or books. Absolutely.
Right.
Nonviolence. Yes, and Dr. Frazier is back, and we were waiting with bated breaths, Dr. Frazier. So please continue.
Went out. Okay, so we're back. I'm gonna speed this up because I want to make sure that we have time to ask questions. And it sounds like you all were already off to a good start talking about that soul force represented through Gandhi. I'm gonna quickly go ahead and review War Without Violence. Sri Harani is more of a shrewd person. He sees this as a political and tactical issue. And so he thinks about it as a function of getting to an end goal. So these are the two types that are emerging. And it's a question about whether civil rights activists are going to follow by Satyagraha or War Without Violence. The first person we're going to talk about, very well, I won't say very well known, she's not as known as she should be. And that's PAULI Murray. If you can go to the next slide. Excellent. So PAULI Murray is a Black woman. She's raised in North Carolina. And actually, I want to add an addendum to that because I'm fudging a little bit. PAULI Murray saw herself as a boy. She would always refer to herself as a boy. So historians have come to see her as a transgender person. However, so much of PAULI Murray's life is structured around this whole question of what does it mean to be a Black woman, and a lot of her activism is about what it means to be a Black woman, that I included her. So she's raised in Durham, North Carolina. Her mother dies early. Her father goes insane from the pressure of having to take care of so many kids. He's committed to Crownsville State Hospital. And in the hospital, he's actually beaten to death by a racist white guard. And PAULI Murray actually has to travel to Baltimore to collect his body and attend the funeral. So this is a rough start for someone who is young. She's actually 12 years old when she has to do this. But a testament to who she is, she eventually moves on. She goes to college and she gets into Howard University Law School, where she has a tough time, in part because of her gender. Many of the Black male professors have issues with her presence there. But there's this interesting moment where in the law school, they're asking this question of how do we get at separate but equal? And most of the students spent time trying to figure out how to deal with the legal ramifications of equal. And Pauli Murray sort of breaks rank and says, how about we just deal with the separate? Let's deal with the problem of segregation itself. A lot of people ignore her, but what's important is that that attitude actually becomes the basis for her theories, not just with regard to Black people, but with regard to women as well. She sets up the intellectual foundation for challenging segregation and overturning Plessy versus Ferguson. She also co-wrote a law review that was actually subsequently used by what people referred to at the time, a rising star of the ACLU, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who actually uses that article to convince the Supreme Court that the Equal Protection Clause has to apply to women. Pauli Murray joins with a number of people who are part of CORE in New York to go to this ashram, which is this cooperative housing space. So she's in this moment where she's being engaged and interacting with people who are embracing not just tactical ideas of nonviolence, but also the philosophical element. And she ends up blending both sides of it. First, she blends it with regard to her role with the March on Washington movement. Interesting enough, the March on Washington movement is a movement 1940s where they are attempting to get the federal government to be more inclusive of Black people and defense jobs. So they're trying to pressure the federal government. Pauli Murray is a major organizer within the organization, and she pushes MOAN to embrace nonviolent civil disobedience. And this is really important. Civil disobedience means that you are challenging the law. Even when the law is illegal, you are engaging in, or is considered legal, you're engaging in protest because it's viewed as immoral, all right? So this is a big thing for Black people to do. Segregation is the law of the land in the South. To say you're gonna challenge it is a frightening thing, partly because of the level of violence. But it's Pauli Murray who pushes the March on Washington movement to embrace that. But the interesting aspect about Pauli Murray is that she also embraces Black leadership. So within the March on Washington movement, nonviolence has got to be directed and dictated by Black leadership only. And this is very interesting because she does this in the 1940s. We'll see this again later in the 1960s with Black Power. She also, while she is a law student at Howard University, trains a number of Black female students to do direct action protests. One of those students, Juanita Nelson, engages in sit-ins, again, in the 1940s. This is well before the 1960s, in protest of segregation in restaurants. Juanita Nelson moves to Cleveland, Ohio, becomes chapter leader of Congress of Racial Equality, where they introduced the idea of going limp. Now, this is actually different from what we see with Mahatma Gandhi, where you're supposed to give in to being arrested. Going limp was a strategy that's added to the nonviolent ends-oriented group, right? That you don't cooperate. That's a part of non-cooperation from their perspective, even though that is counter to what Gandhi had suggested. We're going to move on to the next one because I want to make sure I get through this very quickly. And I'm sorry if I'm going very quickly. We will try to cover as much as possible. Ella Baker is considered the mother of the movement. She is not a fan. Let's go ahead and go right into it. She's not a fan of nonviolence, and that's probably an underestimation of that. What she actually says is that she could not see herself sitting there while racists put a cigarette out on her skin. Her position is that, of course, people can utilize whatever tact is necessary and available to ensure that their freedom. However, she still wanted to avoid giving open cause to attack. And she believed that it was not a good idea to openly carry weapons or engage in any kind of aggressiveness or violence, because that would then undermine the moral standing of the argument that you were trying to make. So she is one of those persons who straddled this idea of nonviolence with a focus on nonviolence being tactical. She plays a key role in also thinking of nonviolence as through the lens of grassroots organizing. She believes in going out to the community and building leadership within the community. So this is also a little bit different from the direct action protest. Direct action protest is generally associated with marches, generally associated with sit-ins, activities in which you yourself are a participant. But with Ella Baker, her belief is that you have to go to the people and then help the people to lift themselves up. And that's through that day-to-day grind of interaction and working with the community. So she's straddling this world of nonviolence, and it's fine for her as long as it's useful. And then if it's not useful, then you turn to something else. And then if we can move on to the next. And then finally, we have another illustration of nonviolence in the form of Ruth Turner. Ruth Turner straddles the fence as well, but I'm going to talk less about the use of armed self-defense, which Ella Baker is partially open to, and more about the question of the strategy of nonviolence. She's dead set against nonviolence and the use of armed self-defense. There is an organization, for example, that creates a gun club, a Malcolm X gun club in Cleveland, Ohio. Ruth Turner's position is that is not helpful and is unnecessary, right? That doesn't move the movement forward. I should also say that Ruth Turner also invites Malcolm X to give a speech in Cleveland, Ohio, and where he gives his famous speech, very well-known speech, The Ballot or the Bullet. And in it, of course, Malcolm X juxtaposes this whole question of either participation in the political process or, in effect, revolution, that it becomes the bullet. And for Ruth Turner, she is more inclined toward the political process, but she really gets pushed in this direction after the death of Reverend Bruce Clunder. Reverend Bruce Clunder is a white minister who was a part of Cleveland Corps. And in the midst of a protest against a segregated school, he is crushed by a bulldozer that runs backwards over his body and crushes him in the ground. This is a moment for all of Cleveland Corps that dramatically changes the organization. And there's an essential question about whether direct action protest continues to be a useful approach. They're thinking about this particularly with regard to police brutality, or should they make a turn and do something similar and use community organizing? For Ruth Turner, there's a way to merge nonviolence with community organizing. She does it through, and the rest of the court do it through tenant strikes. Non-cooperation, you refuse to pay your rent until the landlord makes adjustments to your household and brings it up to par. Black political power, organizing Black folks for both participation as politicians, but also as voters and voter education. Stopping federal funds. This was a key element to non-cooperation and also part of their community organizing strategy. During the 1960s, the federal government provided funds for war on poverty programs in Cleveland, Ohio, but it required that it include poor residents from the community on the committee. So CORE got together and basically stopped federal funding from coming to Cleveland because they would not include poor communities. And that's about that, that's that research element. You locate the power and then you go at the source of the power to force the transformation and change. Black economic power through boycotts and then through cooperatives. So there's a focus on creating an internal support system, and then focusing on power brokers, banks, politicians, business people. They form a sort of Black power element to this nonviolence that helps to affirm the Black community. Next slide. And so now I'm going to end with, what do we mean then with this sort of radical nonviolence? I like to say that I'm sort of caught between my mother with the me and we over, and my father who's let's study Satyagraha. And in between is that radical nonviolence. You don't have to focus on the heart of the oppressor. You can, in fact, be tactical and think about what does it mean to transform the circumstances or the situation of inequality, but do it in such a way that is based in a moral standing, based in a moral approach, and it's still hard-hitting and assertive. Being research informed is important. All right, it gives you the basis on which to make your argument and have your discussion. Taking a tactical approach. So I'll give you a quick example. When students are protesting the circumstances of curriculum, right? What are the committees or what is the group of faculty members involved in determining the curriculum from an institution? Is it the president? Is it a committee? Do you need to go to the trustees? If you go to the trustees, who are those trustees? Where do they work? These kinds of things are about being both research informed, but very tactical about almost like a fillet knife, being very sort of very concise about what it is that you decide to focus on. Non-cooperation, right? Your student funds go to pay for administrators and faculty and all these kinds of things. Is there a way to challenge it through some form of non-cooperation, refusing to accept the food or some other aspect? And then simply being confrontational. And that includes and goes up to blocking doorways, sit-ins, jail-ins. All forms of direct action protest can be confrontational. But there is a way for us to do nonviolence and be effective and to be radical and still take a stand and say no more. And I'll end right there. And I'm so sorry I ran over in my time.
That's okay. We were very entertained talking about your mom and how we understand how it's difficult for you to be your mom's daughter and your dad's daughter. So we felt that in that interview.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Frazier. Now we will move on to our next presenter, Dynasty Ceasar. And as an agent of change, Dynasty Ceasar is dedicated to creating pathways for Black liberation in Milwaukee. She started her career in Lindsay Heights as a community organizer at Running Rebels and focused primarily on eliminating silos, helping residents define their community. She also supported efforts to challenge gentrification and displacement. Dynasty Ceasar also facilitated anti-racism trainings among various organizations and businesses in Milwaukee and Racine with the YWCA Southeast Wisconsin. During the uprisings of 2020, Dynasty was determined to unify the efforts of organizers and outline their desires. She will continue to support efforts in the greater Milwaukee community with a racial justice lens in her role as the Environmental Sustainability Program Coordinator, as she supports Milwaukee residents in their efforts to develop their communities from their perspective. Miss Dynasty Ceasar.
Thank you. Thank you. So today we'll be talking about organizing in Milwaukee, but really with understanding the difference between reform and abolition. Oftentimes when we see organizers, we assume that it all goes into one category, but we really must understand where change comes from. We can go to the next slide. So today I'll provide a brief definition about what reform is versus abolition. I'll give insight into my experience as a reformist and doing abolitionist work. I can only speak from my perspective. As we navigate through this, we oftentimes think that the perspectives of Black women are unified, and Black people in general. We assume that Black people all have the same perspectives and what liberation looks like. So I'm speaking from my own perspective. And then I will highlight other Black women organizers in Milwaukee. It will not be focused primarily on women who have been organizing protests, more so the women who have been organizing on the ground for a while now. So we can go to the next slide. So when we think about reform, it is the act of rearranging or restructuring current systems. So if I can use the analogy of a house, if you're in a house, our country is already built, right? So the policies that we navigate through were created for white people to succeed and not for people of color. And so our house, though we may rearrange the furniture through changing and adjusting the policies, still does not create enough space for Black people to exist and be successful. And so when we look at reformist efforts, oftentimes it's a request for change. And so to go back to what Dr. Frazier said, she spoke about nonviolent teaching and what it looks like to negotiate. Reform activism is usually a request for change. It may sound like a demand, but it's a request as in, I'm asking you to adjust policies and practices and not to destroy the entirety of the structure. And so what ends up happening is that we change the policies and not the practice. So I may change the language to not say that we don't want Black people in a space, but the practice is still there. So the imprint is still there on how white people perceive Black people in spaces. So we're not adjusting the practice. You can go to the next slide. So abolition is the complete removal of the system. So we have to destroy the house that we live in. And I know when we hear that, it sounds very radical, but in order for Black people to exist in a space that makes sense for them, we have to look at the systems that we have and realize that the systems that are there are not do not create space for Black people. So again, to use the same analogy of a house, we would have to redo the foundation, build a house that creates enough space for people of color and Black people, and then create new policies and practices. And it's a demand for change. So we understand that what's in place does not support. And so it's important for us to just look at the system, understand that we cannot navigate through this. There is no way for us to create policies that help people of color, because historically, what's in place was never created for Black people to succeed. In fact, it was never created with the perspective that Black people would have reached the point in which we are today. And so we have to look at the structure, remove it, go back to to use the reference of a house. If we're going to rebuild, we need to go and test that land. So testing that land means understanding the policies that we have in place and not creating a new system that mirrors that and creates a new oppressor. So maybe currently what we have is the people that are in power are usually white people. We don't want to go back and create another system that does not have white people on top, but then creates another system where another group of people are oppressed. We want to create another system that creates space, so another house that creates space for everyone and not just for one group to be successful or back on top. You can go to the next slide. So for me, my experience in reform was really, I say it as being reformist because it was a narrative shift. So instead of me understanding that my purpose was to completely ignore or dismantle the fact that Black people are associated with negative associations, I then went inside of the system to change and address the narrative of 53206. So my purpose in doing that, it was not only just 53206, but 53205 as well. So the Lindsay Heights neighborhood. And those boundaries were 20th, to 8th Street, and then Walnut to Locust. And within those boundaries, we did a number of things. We worked with residents to create an identity, to determine what they thought their narrative was and what does it mean to live in Lindsay Heights, what does it mean to be a resident of that area, rather than going through the narrative about the fact that 53206 is the most incarcerated community. Oftentimes people think that that association means that that area is bad and that residents don't care about their neighborhood, and that's not a fact. There are many residents that do care about that area and many people that are dedicated to creating change and creating a better lifestyle for them. I also did a history acknowledgement. So working at Running Rebels, I did focus on creating a Black History Month program that was open to the community. It was something for this organization has been an anchor in the neighborhood for 40 years, and it's important for us to make sure that residents know their history, that Milwaukee residents know their history, and that the history of Black people does not end with being enslaved or being in bondage, and that there have been success stories that Black people have, and it's important for us to make sure that we remember that and that other people remember that. I consider this to be a reformist effort because it is acknowledging the history, but we are not acknowledging the fact that we are not the only people who need to acknowledge our history. Black people, white people also need to acknowledge their history and the history in this nation and how this nation was founded on, as Dr. Frazier talked about, this nation was founded on violence, and so we need to acknowledge the negative history that's associated with whiteness as well. Anti-displacement and gentrification efforts were really focused on my involvement with the city of Milwaukee is developing the comprehensive plan for Fond du Lac and North Avenue, which is really a document that can help communities hold developers accountable and then also define what they'd like to see in their neighborhoods. And so being involved in that has really helped me look at what the outside perspective is. Our concerns were really about the development of downtown, which in my opinion may not be as difficult now considering the pandemic, and so people are not as anxious as before, but we were worried about our neighborhood being gentrified and not having any representation, having no representation of people of color or the people who have lived in this neighborhood, which again goes back to the efforts of defining the identity of a community. If you do not have an identity determined, someone will come into your community and determine that identity for you. And then the final effort for me was the Community Planning Council. So the Community Planning Council has been in Lindsay Heights for 20 years now. It is the place where elected officials, representatives of the community and community organizations come to discuss matters of the neighborhood. It is specific to Lindsay Heights, but we were trying to expand this out to other communities as a way to leverage our voices with our elected officials to unify. Oftentimes, if you're in a community, if I live on, let's say if I live on 20th and Walnut, and there are residents that live on the other side of Locust, so on the north side of Locust, that are experiencing the same things that I'm experiencing, if I'm not talking to them, there are things that can happen that don't make sense for me. Maybe my community wants that, but their community doesn't. And if we're not talking to each other, we really don't know all of the ins and outs of what's happening. So the Community Planning Council was really a space where if there was something happening in the neighborhood, you would have to come to the Community Planning Council essentially to be vetted, to bring a business into the neighborhood, or have an event or something like that. It was really a stronghold that residents had to say what they wanted to see and what they did not want to see in the neighborhood. So those are my efforts doing reformist work. So experience with abolition, I think when we hear abolition, it sounds like such a radical term, because we're not certain of what's coming on the other side. So if we destroy a system, what's to come after that? So for example, we've been having conversations, or people have been having conversations about abolishing the police. And then there's another discussion about what's on the other side of that, what's the other option. And so what's important to do is to create a system that makes sense for next generation. So you need to be able to test it by understanding what has happened in the past, what hasn't worked, and then what systems are in place. A lot of the times we'll hear people talk, for me, I'm big on discussing capitalism and how capitalism reinforces the isms that oppress people, especially racism. If you're not willing to turn away from an organization that has previously had racist policies or practices, and you continue to indulge or continue to support financially to that organization, you are essentially supporting racism. So for example, if you bank at a bank that historically did not give loans to Black people, then you're still banking there. So you're still supporting that organization and you're keeping them afloat. And when we're not prepared to step away from that system, oftentimes it's because we don't know what's on the other side. Now, what do I do with my money? Now, where do I go if I cannot go to that bank? And so testing it first, understanding what policies and practices are in place and what organizations have failed at supporting Black people, and then going into the envisioning part. So for me, that's where I am, envisioning a sustainable neighborhood or sustainable communities that are self-reliant and are not reliant on the policies or organizations that have historically oppressed people of color or Black people, is where I am. So I'm envisioning that, I'm strategizing, I'm writing out what euphoria looks like for me, or what euphoria looks like for Black people. I think with abolition, it's not only the discussion that I need to have with Black people, but also white people need to be prepared to turn away from that system too. Historically, we've seen areas like Tulsa, Oklahoma, that where Black people have chosen to separate or do things in a separate manner, which have been destroyed. So what we need to do is not only find a system that supports Black people, where they don't need to depend on the systems that have oppressed them, but also a space where white people feel comfortable leaving that same system, because white people cannot continue to support that system either. And so in building that, it's about really developing, for me, currently, as I said, I'm envisioning, but also in building that, it's encouraging for me, encouraging other Black people and white people to see that what we have right now is not only falling apart, because if you look at the current state of affairs, COVID-19 has also affected the way that we do business. Businesses are struggling to maintain, and so, but the numbers are not dropping, and so businesses have opened back up to support that, but we're still worried about people being sick. That's because our current system, capitalism, is falling apart right now. And so we not only need to start thinking about what the future looks like, because we don't want racism to be still intact, but we also need to be thinking about what the future looks like, because what we're standing on is falling apart anyway. The foundation is pretty rocky right now. So you can go to the next slide. So with that, I'd like to highlight a few people that I've seen in other communities, not only just in Lindsay Heights, but in other neighborhoods around Milwaukee that deserve to be highlighted. So Imonia Barnett is a Lindsay Heights resident who has really dedicated her time to, again, focusing on changing the narrative about the community. She started the Warriors and Uplifters of 5 through 206, which really has changed which really has changed the narrative, or really has addressed the narrative. And I'm sorry, somebody's doing construction outside, so I don't know if you can hear that. But she's really focused on changing the narrative, not only for the area that she lives in, but specifically her block. And she's done a great deal of work with having residents come into that space, feeling comfortable. We have Halloween coming up, and so she's tried to make sure that residents feel comfortable trick-or-treating on their block on 17th and Walnut, 17th and North Avenue, to feel comfortable at night, as she did when she was a young person. She also works with the community wealth builders of Lindsay Heights. So it's really an effort that's a partnership with residents and Walnut Way to support the residents that are in the community that have skills, which goes back to the conversation about being an abolitionist and really wanting to create a new system by supporting the skills and the resources of the people in our community. Oftentimes we forget that we are the resource that our country depends on, that we are the resource that are the people who are the people that are in the stores, that are working, the people that know how to do things to sustain their living. We assume that that always has to be associated with finances, but it's a skill that that person has that is valuable. And so the community wealth building model goes to really focus on finding those residents in the neighborhood who have skills and supports them in making sure that they can start their own businesses in doing so. Are you telling me that I'm running low on time? Okay, I'll hurry up. I'm sorry. Okay, so Sherry Fuqua is a resident of, it's between Midtown and Sherman Park, but she developed the middle ground to join those areas together because they're across the street from each other. So Ms. Sherry has really focused on providing experience for young people to maintain gardens and maintain community spaces. And she provides them with a financial aspect to make sure that they are staying active during the summer. And then Melanie McCurtis from Metcalf Park is someone who I really, really respect, and I'm really excited to speak about her. Most people know that she has been doing a lot of work with the COVID-19 pandemic. She's really, her and Danelle Cross have fed their entire neighborhood countless times during the COVID-19 pandemic. Many people were without food, and they refused to let that happen in their community. So I really commend them for that. And then Megan Shepard Smith is from the Midtown neighborhood, and I've worked with her on helping residents stay informed about their tax assessments. Tax assessments are really something where residents feel like currently, where they feel like they can be displaced because they're not able to afford the tax increase. And so Megan Shepard Smith had really helped me with trying to make sure that residents were informed and they had the information to combat that. So I'm running low on time. I apologize for that. And that is it. That is all I have to say.
That is quite okay. That is quite okay. We know we had a few technical difficulties in the beginning, and because of that, we're going to go a little longer. So we're going to try to get as many questions in as possible, and go to 6:25. So you know, just what powerful presentations from both of you. And I mean, I liked when Dynasty said we want to create space for everyone to have a part and not one group on top of another. So we have to kind of reimagine. And then I loved most incarcerated does not mean the neighborhood is bad, because I have so many good friends in Lindsay Heights, and that is so true, you know. And so you just need to really know the people. And I think from both of you, I got, you know, asset-based community development is really what you're doing, because you're pulling out the strengths in the community and having the community solve their own problems. So with that said, I think we're going to go ahead and go to some of the questions that came in from registrants. And the first one, Black women are often characterized and contributing behind the scenes or under-recognized compared to the scope of their contributions. Why do you think this is the case? And why is it important historically and now for Black women's voices to be more central and more prominent?
So I will start us off, but first of all, I have to say, Dynasty, thank you so much. I had to go get my fan out, honey. I was fanning the whole time you was talking and doing the amen. I have to tell you, I was like, yes. And it's so true to the spirit of the 1960s and the civil rights movement. And I would say, as a historian, I think part of that may be the fault of historians and scholars. We have a tendency to focus on male leadership. And we have a tendency to translate history as a top-down process. I told students yesterday that we focus on Martin Luther King. What we don't hear is the story about how the mothers of the church had to pull his coattail because he did not want to be a leader in the Montgomery bus boycott. And they had to explain to him that nobody cared what he thought. And he was going to do what they said, right? And so there's a way in which we have a tendency to cover over women's power because we don't see it, right, in that front leadership. And so we assume that's not leadership if you're not out at the front, if you're not in front of the camera. And we all know that there's many people in front of the camera, but that don't make them leaders. And that's an unfortunate aspect of how scholars have then had a tendency to focus on the camera versus the person who was out there doing the labor. So I think part of that
socialized that way, right? We're all socialized that way in this country.
Right, exactly. So I do think that's a problem. The scholarship is trying to address that by adding more conversation about the role of Black women as bridge leaders. They like to use the terminology of soft power, again, not wanting to acknowledge power by women. But there are ways in which Black women have, not just ways, Black women have been the backbone of the Black freedom movement, period. Okay. And it's through the organizing, it's through the direction, it's through the ideology, somebody like Pauli Murray, it's through the theoretical underpinnings of how to fight racism and sexism. So they're absolutely essential. And if we want to understand some of the true strategies of the movement, then you have to be looking at Black women and the work that they do.
Dr. Frazier, I just want to let you know I was over here like this the whole time when you were talking. So, and I couldn't hold it when we got back on screen. That was the first thing I did. So thank you so much. And I was very inspired. You made me feel like, okay, I could talk about this. So thank you. I think to Dr. Frazier's point, it's definitely important for us to recognize, I think, even for me, from my experience being at protests, that oftentimes that person with the bullhorn isn't the most important person. They're just the voice of what we want you to say. You should be saying what I tell you to say as a unit. This is we are here to support the movement. We're not here to support the person with the bullhorn. And I think oftentimes we forget that. And so when we're talking about Black women being in those spaces, like, well, why isn't there a Black woman holding the bullhorn? And I don't think we have respect for the fact that the Black woman should be able to choose where she wants to be. And if I don't want to be in front with the bullhorn and I want to be here making sure that things are organized, I don't need you to tell me that that in order for me to be important, I need to be in front of people. I'm in front of them because I've told them that they need to stand over here, they need to do this, or I'm already in front. There's no need for me to hold that bullhorn. And so I think, to Dr. Frazier's point, we need to address what we think is power, and also respect the fact that liberation for a Black woman and liberation for Black people is not defined by anyone else but the individual that's experiencing it. And we need to stop telling Black people and Black women specifically that if you are too quiet, you know, you're not sharing your voice. I like to be that person that's in a meeting that waits until the end of the meeting to speak, because I'm processing what I want to say, and I make sure that I speak with purpose. And I don't feel the need to have someone say, well, are you worried about a stereotype, or are you worried about this? No, I'm not. I'm being myself, and that's liberation for a Black woman, and that's power for her.
Absolutely, absolutely. This question is to Dynasty, and you know, in Milwaukee, we have people who are protesting. We just had a decision not to charge a Wauwatosa police officer in a fatal shooting, and the protest started then. You have been a part of protests. Can you kind of provide a synopsis of this year's protests and demonstrations in Milwaukee, and how do they come together, and what are their demands?
Sure. So I can only speak from my perspective and the perspective of the group that I organized with and what we were focused on, but also acknowledging the fact that there were many different protests scheduled this summer, and there were many different aspects of liberation. And I think we need to acknowledge that for Black people, that we have different perspectives for what liberation looks like. I think for me, I first of all, I'm really not a protester. This is something that is new for me. I like to strategize and think about what we're talking about. And I think that this summer was an opportunity for us. It felt like such an opportunity for us to call upon change, because not only were there things happening, but for the first time, the country actually acknowledged that there were things happening to Black people, because we had no distractions. We couldn't watch Keeping Up with the Kardashians because they weren't, there's no new shows coming on. We've got to watch reruns. And so we can focus on what's happening to Black people. And so for me, I can give a synopsis of what I've seen and the people that I've organized with. And I think really our focus was on calling out the organizations and letting organizations know. We were in part some of the people that were protesting businesses. And so businesses having Black Lives Matter signs out and not really knowing what that means, and not really being able to say that, and then not recognizing that though it's important for us to keep the economy flowing, the economy and having bars and things like that open is literally ignoring the fact that Black people are struggling and need your help. And so just saying that you have a sign out saying that Black Lives Matter doesn't acknowledge the fact that you are also a bar that had policies, had dress codes and things like that, that literally kept Black people from being able to come into your bars because your policies were racist. And so for us, it was really a demand on organizations to tell us why they support us, while we strategize to say what euphoria actually looks like for us. So calling out organizations and making sure that people were being held accountable for the support that they say that they have for Black people, that we haven't seen. You've never had a Black Lives Matter sign outside of your organization until 2020. You could have had that years ago. Those signs are not new. And so for us, we were really focused on demanding truth and holding people accountable and being honest. We weren't so much focused on calling out, not to say we didn't find issue with what was happening in terms of police. We definitely do, but we recognize that police are policy enforcers. They are not the creators of the policies. And so you have to go farther and focus more on all of it and not just on the little pieces of it. And so that's why we focus primarily on calling out capitalism.
Absolutely. Yeah, actions speak louder than words, totally. Dr. Frazier, what do you see as similarities and differences between some of the demonstrations this year compared to those during the Civil Rights Movement?
First of all, before we go, I have to amen Dynasty again. Some of the work that I do is on gentrification as well. And it's really important to understand that police are enforcers for the state. There's a process that is underway for removal of Black people that involves developers, cities, and all kinds of strategies. And so the police are there to implement those strategies as they are put forth through a whole structure in place. So we have multiple levels at which we have to engage when it comes to this issue of racism. And when we think about Breonna Taylor, the family actually challenged the city and made the argument that they believe part of what happened to her had to do with the fact that the city was pushing gentrification and utilizing the police in that process. So we have to understand that a lot of this is linked. Now, to your specific question, the comparisons, I think what's interesting about the civil rights movement is there is this sort of moment where we cross over and then all of a sudden we have white participation, which is definitely a unique element. You see it in the civil rights movement as well, but the aggressiveness of some of the white participants, that's a new addendum to civil rights action. To Dynasty's point, for some reason, there always seems to be a kind of threshold moment. And I think certainly what happened with George Floyd is that threshold moment that somehow makes it more clear than the other 500 other times that Black people actually do have experience of police brutality. And even they sort of had a recognition of the extreme ridiculousness of violence that Black people have to face. So I do think that those two moments are similarities, both in the civil rights movement in the 1960s and in this current moment. I do think that the strategies are very much different. On a couple of fronts. Obviously, the use of technology and social media has been a massive boon for being able to organize. But the difference is that there's something about the person-to-person organizing that allows for a sustainability in the way that the digital does not. And I do think that that is a key missing element. You can organize faster, you can organize more broadly, you can notify more quickly, but that I'm coming down to the church and say, you know, Miss Celia, I noticed you was not at the protests yesterday, right? That kind of person-to-person interaction is sorely missed. And I think that when we think about Ella Baker and the work that she did, or Ruth Turner, who, by the way, is my aunt, that on the ground is really, really important, because that's how you get that sort of consistent sustaining of engagement by the community. It's not just a hot button moment. It's not just a hot button event. And then the non-cooperation element. And I loved Dynasty's example of the bank, right? This bank is a participant in white supremacy and your money is there. So how do you practice non-cooperation? Right, we remove your money from the bank, but to Dynasty's point, where you can't put it in the mattress, right? Where are you going to put the money? And so you get into these levels of complication. Even Gandhi says that non-cooperation is not for everybody. If I am hungry and trying to feed my babies, I don't have time to be figuring out what bank I'm going to be at, right? So these are sort of elements that I don't see present in today's current efforts. And I think it would be helpful to do more aggressive incorporation of non-cooperation and help to facilitate for those who don't have the time, right? To facilitate for them ways to participate in non-cooperation that's not too onerous, that's not too burdensome. Life is burdensome enough. You don't need to add in another thing, right? If you are an activist, that's one way that you can help. And then finally, with strategies like the jail in, that's one of the elements that I do find that's missing. And going limp, I haven't seen that a lot. But going lip is an incredible form of non-cooperation. There is nothing like trying to haul some big-boned person like myself into a car, right? That hinders the process of the police to arrest you. And then the jailing, that when you fill up the jails, it becomes the city's and the state's problems to pay for you. That's a commitment that a lot of people cannot afford, but some people did do that. So that's also something that is missing. But they are very much committed and very much in the spirit of the 60s. And in a lot of ways, they are still borrowing from many elements of the 1960s and talking generationally as well to members of SNCC and particularly members of the Black Power movement.
Dynasty, you want to add to that?
No. No, I think Dr. Frazier did a great job. I think the only thing I would say is at the beginning, what you mentioned, I think when we ask for justice, it sounds like we're demanding it, right? But you cannot demand justice in a system that does not support you. You will never get it. We'll never be satisfied with the results. Doesn't matter what situation happens, we'll never be satisfied. That is not the justice at which we envisioned. And so we'll continue to be disappointed if we do not dismantle what's already in place.
And that is also a difference from the civil rights movement. Now we're moving more inclined toward the sort of Black nationalist perspective, very revolutionary approach to saying that the system is in and of itself corrupt and there's no changing, correcting, that kind of thing. The civil rights movement still had this notion of possibility of participation in the American body politic, which is why their approach was reformist, right? But we are, 50 years out? So a lot of people have gotten past that point of, okay, y'all can't help yourself. So we'll just get rid of it all.
Right. You had your shot. So our Dynasty kind of touched on this just a little bit, but what is the role of white allies, whites committed to Black freedom struggles?
I can, if it's okay, I'll talk about it first. Are you finished asking the question? I'm sorry.
Yes. I was gonna say historically and currently. So you start currently.
Okay. So, and I know that Dr. Frazier will speak more about the historical aspect of it, but I think when we look at, again, from this perspective of reform and from abolitionists, historically, one of the things that I think about the most is the women's suffrage movement, and how some of our idols, or some of the nation's idols, like Susan B. Anthony, were supporting white supremacy in their notion for white women to be able to vote. And so it comes across as this allyship of like, yeah, we're here, but we're here sometimes to get what we need, or we're here for me, I think what we really saw over the summer is a lot of it was guilt. We had a group, someone had asked a couple of us to help them facilitate a white allyship training this summer for protesters. And the question was asked, what does Black Lives Matter mean to you? And it was silence. No one raised their hand. And most of the group was predominantly white, and no one had a response to that question. And so you're here and you've been marching for, I think we were at almost 100 days at that point. You've been here, and you have no answer to this question. And so for me, white allyship is really difficult to pinpoint. Oftentimes white people don't really understand the depths of racism in the first place and what it really means and what they will have to give up to be an ally is like someone asking you to give up something, what can I think of? If you're a person who is disabled, if someone asks you to give up your ability to now transition and now to be disabled, would you be willing to give that up? And so when we talk about allyship, it's giving up what you think, what you had before. Are you willing to not have that? And it doesn't mean now you have to be oppressed. And I think oftentimes that's the fear of now white people are transitioning, we're changing roles. Black people will become the oppressor and white people will become the oppressed. That's not what we're asking for in allyship. But allyship really only comes in an abolitionist form. You have to be willing to walk away from the banks that you support. You'll have to stop shopping at the stores. When you find out that this organization or this business is racist, you have to stop going there. You have to stop doing a bunch of stuff that you're not prepared to do. And so really, where can you start? Is that something that you're really comfortable with doing? Walking away from everything that was created despite Black people, and then also to support you. Are you willing to turn away from all of that? And so that's a real question that you have to ask if that's someone that really wants to be an ally.
And I'll add a couple of things. I would say in terms of allyship, I'd just be happy if you go talk to your own family and your friends, because therein lies the real crux of the problem, is that you're not just willing to give up, you're also unwilling to confront within your midst and make people uncomfortable with saying certain kinds of things in front of you. And in fact, this is what happens in the 1960s. At some point, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, says to its white members, thank you, but we no longer need your assistance. But what you can do is go back home and talk to your own people and do organizing in your community, because the issue of racism is a white person's issue. Black people bear the brunt of it, but white people have the problem with racism since they are the ones who are instituting that issue, that process. So organize around that issue, train in your own community, correct in your own community. And a lot of people were disaffected, white members were disaffected because as much as they were willing to go into the Black community and do support work, what they were not willing to do was go back home. And say something to folks back home. The other element that also came up during the 1960s and was centrally around the whole question of what is white leadership is, how do you take directions? Are you prepared to accept Black leadership? And this was a recurring problem. Even PAULI Murray, who is a very supportive of integration, when she's part of March on Washington movement, as I pointed out, she's very clear. There should be only Black leadership within the organization. When we get to the 1960s, it happens in CORE, it happens in SNCC. And Black folks are saying, Black people who are bearing the burden have to be at the forefront of making the decisions about how to protest and do the things that are going to have long-term impact on them. And that became a real problem. A number of white members left those organizations and they ended up joining another movement, either the women's movement, or they went on to focus on the Vietnam War. So in other words, instead of thinking about what does it mean to be under Black leadership, or instead of thinking about what does it mean to go home and challenge racism at home, they simply went to the next protest as a way to avoiding these key issues. So I would argue that if you want to do true allyship, part of that is listening to Black people and taking directions and hearing all the ways in which they conceive of how to move forward and how you can be a part of that, right? Not your variation or your variational version of that, but what do they say, and then following that. And then finally, what does it mean to challenge racism within, both within the personal self and then within in terms of your own circle of people, which you might find might be a dwindling circle when you start doing that. And that's also uncomfortable.
So it's about 6:23, and so we have room or time for one extra question. And I want to kind of give us a sense of hope, I guess, you know. So what words do you have for our young women who are losing hope, maybe losing hope, and do not know how to begin to help be a part of the change that's needed, or even the change that they really want to see? And I'll have each of you answer that, whoever wants to go first.
So I was in a wonderful session today dealing with folks who are doing community work around housing and the problem of gentrification. And an indigenous woman, Lakota, came and she was sharing her story, and she talked about getting tired, but she also talked about her belief of hope in action and leading with the soul. And I just thought that was so beautiful. And I was like, oh, I'm gonna say that tonight. Because I think that is just right on point. Hope in action is grounded in seeing the movement, seeing the work that we do, seeing that we are together, and we're taking steps for our empowerment and for our freedom. And yes, you get tired. I don't believe in having these conversations about, you know, when we were slaves, we kept, no, we get tired. And there's nothing wrong with being tired. But as my father says, you get yourself energized, take your break, and then you get yourself energized and you get back in there. And then you reflect hope and action. And in the process, hopefully, you inspire someone else. And one last thing, just a quick note, I'm going to put in the body of the chat some of the work that I was doing with dealing with COVID was to create a guidebook for Black folks to help them survive COVID. It includes housing assistance, cash fund information on how to grow your food, where to find food. So if you all know of organizations or need a resource for how to deal with some of the things that are happening to you while COVID and the pandemic is happening, you can go to that link and get it, download it as necessary.
Thank you, Dynasty.
So for me, I'd say to the young women who are maybe losing hope sometimes, and sometimes I'm that young woman. So what I will say is that it's okay to pace yourself. I think right now everything feels very urgent. And so people are scrambling because we feel like there's a little window where we can really create change, but it's important for us to strategize. And so take that time really looking at what you think euphoria looks like, and then writing it out and really plotting and strategizing that. It's okay to take that time. And so I think that you'd find hope in the fact that you see what euphoria looks like, and that we're in a space that we can obtain that. You just have to make sure you've got it down and you know exactly what it looks like.
Thank you so much. I know that everyone on this call joins me in probably wanting to jump up and give you a standing ovation. We can't do that. I mean, I kind of can, but you all were awesome, very authentic, and I just appreciated your conversation, and I know everybody did as well. I want to apologize to those who did have some extra questions in the chat. We just ran out of time and couldn't get to everyone, but I hope that you enjoyed the discussion that we ended on. And you know, further, let's thank the Center for Peacemaking and Curdo for putting this on and bringing us all together. And it just helps us to deepen our historical understandings of nonviolent peacemaking and how it can be applied today. So if you want further information, you can go to any one of those organizations and get that information. Again, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and go out and be peaceful. Thank you.